My name is Detective Raymond Cross, and for months, I've been hunting a shadow, a killer the media dubbed the Leather Phantom. It's not a name I care for, but it's stuck. The murders were savage, calculated, and terrifying. Each victim was left mutilated, their bodies posed like macabre works of art. And always, a playing card marked with a skull insignia was left behind. I've seen things in my career that keep me awake at night, but this case? It consumed me. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no pattern to the victims. Just chaos. But chaos always leaves a trace, and I was determined to find it. One rainy evening, I sat in my office surrounded by case files and the cards left at each scene. I spread them out, studying the intricate skull insignia on each one. That's when I noticed something, a subtle variation in the design from card to card. It was a clue, hidden in plain sight. I called in a favor from an old friend, a cryptography professor. Together, we deciphered it. The insignia revealed a set of coordinates. The location was an abandoned leather tannery on the outskirts of town. It was a place I'd driven past 100 times but never thought twice about. That night, I went alone. Maybe it was foolish, but I needed to end this. The tannery was a decaying husk of a building, its walls covered in graffiti, the air thick with the stench of rot. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I stepped inside. The sound of rain on the broken windows was the only noise, aside from my own breathing. I moved carefully, every creak of the floorboards putting me on edge. Then I saw it. A faint flicker of light coming from a room down the hall. As I approached, I smelled burning wax and something else. Something metallic. Blood. The room was lit by candles, their flames casting eerie shadows. And there he was, standing in the center. He wore a long, tattered coat and a grotesque leather mask that covered his entire face. The mask was stitched together from mismatched patches, with hollow eyes and jagged teeth carved into the surface. In his hand, he held a knife that gleamed in the candlelight. He turned to face me, his voice distorted through the mask. "You've come farther than the others," he said, almost amused. "But this is where it ends." I drew my gun, keeping my aim steady. "Drop the knife. It's over." He didn't listen. He lunged at me, faster than I expected. My first shot missed, the sound deafening in the confined space. We collided, and the impact sent us both crashing to the ground. His knife slashed dangerously close, tearing into my coat as we struggled. I fought to disarm him, slamming his hand against the floor until the blade clattered away. With a surge of adrenaline, I ripped the mask from his face. My breath caught. It was Dr. Elias Grayson, the psychiatrist who had consulted on the case. The man who had sat across from me, analyzing the killer's mind. "Why?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why do this?" Grayson laughed, blood trickling from a cut on his lip. "You'll never understand," he said. "The world is a stage, detective, and I merely gave it the horror it craves." I cuffed him, my hands trembling. The sound of sirens in the distance told me backup was finally here. Officers stormed the building and hauled Grayson away, his laughter echoing as they took him. He looked at me one last time, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. Pride? Satisfaction? Whatever it was, it chilled me. Later, I sat alone in my office, trying to piece it all together. Grayson's files were spread across my desk, his past cases, his published papers, even his personal history. The man had always been fascinated by the concept of fear, studying it, dissecting it. But somewhere along the way, he had become consumed by it. His murders weren't random. They were experiments, each one an attempt to perfect the ultimate act of terror. The city could finally breathe again, but I couldn't. I had caught the killer, but the darkness he'd unleashed still lingered. Some nights, I see his mask in my dreams, and I wonder if I'll ever really be free of it. Weeks after his arrest, I received a letter. It had no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a single line: "The stage is yours now, detective." Enclosed was another playing card, this one blank except for the skull insignia in the corner. I burned the card, but the unease stayed with me. Grayson was locked away, but his words echoed in my mind. "The world is a stage," he had said. And I couldn't help but feel like the curtain hadn't fully closed. The weeks turned into months, and I found myself obsessing over Grayson's cryptic parting words. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw his mask, those hollow eyes, the jagged teeth. It wasn't just the mask that haunted me, it was the way he wore it, as if it was a second skin. I couldn't help but wonder how long he'd been hiding behind it, and more importantly, what he was hiding from. I spent hours in the evidence room, poring over every scrap of information we'd gathered on him. Grayson had been meticulous, almost obsessive, in covering his tracks. The playing cards, the victims, the locations. None of it was random. Each piece was part of a larger puzzle, one I wasn't sure I'd ever fully solve. One night, I decided to visit him. It wasn't protocol, but I needed answers. The prison was cold and unwelcoming, the kind of place that seemed designed to sap the humanity out of anyone who entered. Grayson was waiting for me in the visitation room, his hands cuffed to the table. He looked thinner, but his eyes were just as piercing. "Detective Cross," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need to know why," I said, sitting across from him. "Not the philosophical nonsense you spouted before. The real reason. Why did you do it?" He leaned back, studying me. "Have you ever felt truly alive, detective? Not just existing, but alive? That's what fear does. It strips away the mundane, the trivial, and leaves only the raw essence of life. My victims. They were my canvas. And the world, my audience." "You're insane," I said, my voice low. "You destroyed lives for your own twisted amusement. And yet, here you are," he replied, his smile widening. "Still playing the game. Tell me, detective, have you ever considered that we're not so different? You hunt monsters because it makes you feel alive. I create them for the same reason." I left the prison that night with more questions than answers. Grayson's words gnawed at me, planting seeds of doubt I couldn't shake. Was he right? Was I as addicted to the chase as he was to the kill? As the months passed, I threw myself into my work, taking on case after case to drown out the noise in my head. But no matter how many criminals I caught, I couldn't escape the shadow of the leather phantom. His legacy loomed over me, a constant reminder of the darkness I'd glimpsed, both in him and in myself. One day, I received a package at the precinct. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a leather mask, identical to the one Grayson had worn. There was no note, no explanation, just the mask. My first instinct was to destroy it, but something stopped me. Instead, I locked it away in my desk, where it remained, a silent testament to the case that had changed me forever. Even now, years later, I can't help but wonder if Grayson was right. The world is a stage, and we are all players. But if that's true, I've come to realize that I'm not just a player. I'm a reluctant director in a script I never wanted to write. Every case, every crime scene, every victim is a new act in a play that never seems to end. And the mask? It feels like a prop waiting for its cue, a reminder that the shadows I chase might one day consume me. The package reignited something I thought I had buried, the nagging suspicion that Grayson's game wasn't over. Despite being confined to a maximum security prison, his influence seemed to seep into every corner of my life. The mask wasn't just a cruel taunt, it was a challenge. And deep down, I knew the answer wasn't locked away in Grayson's cell. It was out there, somewhere in the city, waiting for me to find it. I started to notice strange patterns in my day-to-day work. Petty crimes escalated into acts of shocking violence. Ordinary people, teachers, accountants, shopkeepers, were committing heinous acts they couldn't explain. The city felt different, like a pressure was building just below the surface. It wasn't long before I started connecting the dots. The victims, the locations, the timing, it all pointed back to Grayson. I returned to the prison, this time armed with more than just questions. Grayson greeted me with his usual unsettling composure, his hands folded neatly on the table. "Back so soon, detective?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "I must admit, I missed our chats." "Cut the act, Grayson," I snapped. "You're pulling strings from in here. I don't know how, but I'll figure it out." He tilted his head, a look of genuine curiosity crossing his face. "And what makes you think I need to pull strings? Chaos is a fire, detective. Once lit, it burns on its own." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "You're not as clever as you think. Whatever game you're playing, I'll end it. Just like I ended you." His smile faltered for the briefest moment, but it returned, sharper than before. "You think this is about me?" he asked. "Oh, detective, you've barely scratched the surface. The stage is much bigger than you realize." I left the prison with a knot in my stomach. Grayson's words were infuriatingly cryptic, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. If he wasn't the one orchestrating the chaos, then who, or what, was? And why did it feel like I was already a step behind? The answer came a few weeks later in the form of another package, this one delivered to my home. Inside was another playing card, but this one was different. The skull insignia was replaced with a depiction of two masks, one smiling, one weeping, surrounded by flames. Beneath it was a single word, Encore. The package also contained a flash drive. I hesitated before plugging it into my laptop, half expecting it to unleash some kind of virus. Instead, it played a video. The footage was grainy, but the scene was unmistakable. A man in a leather mask, similar to Grayson's but with subtle differences, standing over a bound victim. The victim's screams were muffled, and the masked figure raised a knife, the screen cutting to black just before the blade came down. A distorted voice spoke one word, "Your move." My blood ran cold. This wasn't Grayson. It was someone else, someone continuing his work, or worse, someone inspired by it. The playing card, the mask, the theatrics, it was all a twisted homage. But what terrified me most was the realization that Grayson had been right. The chaos didn't die with him. It had only just begun. I spent the next few days in a frenzy, piecing together every clue, every lead. The card's design, the symbolism, the subtle cues in the video, they all pointed to a new player in Grayson's game. Someone who had studied his methods, perhaps even admired them. And they weren't just mimicking him, they were trying to surpass him. The trail led me to an underground theater hidden in the city's abandoned subway tunnels. It was a place I hadn't known existed, a relic of a bygone era. The theater was decrepit, its once grand stage now a crumbling ruin. But as I descended into the darkness, I felt the weight of eyes watching me. The stage was set, literally. Candles lined the edges, casting flickering shadows across the room. In the center stood the masked figure from the video, their stance eerily similar to Grayson's. But this time, there was no knife, only a spotlight, focused squarely on me. "Welcome, detective," the figure said, their voice distorted but undeniably calm. "The curtain rises on Act 2. I drew my gun, stepping cautiously toward the stage. "Take off the mask. Now." The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "This isn't about me, detective. It's about you. Grayson saw something in you, and so do I. You're more than an audience member. You're a star." The room seemed to close in around me as the figure continued. "You wanted answers, didn't you? The truth? Well, here it is. The game was never about catching me, or even Grayson. It was about what comes next. The choices you make. The lines you're willing to cross." They stepped closer, the spotlight shifting with them. "So, detective, will you play your part? Or will you let the curtain fall?" I didn't hesitate. I fired, the shot echoing through the theater. The figure crumpled to the ground, their masks shattering as they fell. But when I approached, my heart sank. It wasn't the person from the video, it was someone else entirely, a puppet in this twisted production. From the shadows, a voice whispered, soft and mocking, "Bravo, detective. The show must go on." And I realized, with a sinking certainty, that the Leather Phantom's legacy wasn't a person or a mask. It was an idea, one that had already taken root in the darkest corners of the city, and perhaps, in the darkest corners of myself.